to the session, Dreaming Big to Rebuild Southeastern Grasslands. In this hour, we're joined by Dwayne Estes, who is the co-founder and executive director at the Southeastern Grasslands Institute, or SGI. He is a professor of biology at Austin Peay State University in Clarksville, Tennessee. Since co-founding SGI with colleague Theo Witzel, the two have assembled a team of nearly 50 staff and have raised nearly $45 million in 8 years. Dwayne enjoys studying historical ecology, flora, working with diverse stakeholders, and fundraising. Please join me in welcoming Dwayne.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thanks to all the prairie enthusiasts. My name is Dwayne Estes. I am going to shut my camera off just to make sure I've got the bandwidth I need, and I look forward to entertaining some questions at the end. So let's get going. First of all, I've also found my voice as a writer, and I would encourage you, if you haven't, take a look at my Substack, one of the new form of social media. Hit me up at theprairiepreacher.substack.com, and you can read some of the writings that I'll be putting on periodically. Also follow SGI on Facebook. Check us out on Instagram, and eventually we'll be getting our YouTube account up and running as well. I start this talk with a photograph of something that may not look like a grassland, right? This is a forested mountain slope in Maryland, one of the places that very few would associate with the grassland region. But even Maryland and Pennsylvania and Virginia and states like that are more typically thought of as the South, like Tennessee, Mississippi, Arkansas, all of these regions historically had wonderfully diverse native grasslands of many different types, as I'll tell you. This is a photograph from Catoctin Mountain in Maryland, looking out toward the southwest across what is known as the Great Valley, sort of the northern extension of the Shenandoah Valley. There were great grasslands here, the historical record tells us, dating back into the 1720s and 1730s, but they've largely been replaced. So again, I want to talk to you about grasslands that are more in the eastern, particularly the southeastern United States, is a major subject of my talk today. And importantly, we're going to talk about what can we do now in this very challenging time that we live in here in the 21st century. A lot of change is happening. What can we do to dream big and continue to think outside the box to help save forgotten grasslands, not just those of the South, but those all across our nation. So let's get going. One of the first things I want to make sure we talk about is this broad umbrella definition of grasslands. The Southeastern Grasslands Institute sort of uses a broad definition. We recognize prairies, sure, everybody does, but we also embrace wonderfully diverse treed grasslands like the savannas. This is a beautiful shortleaf pine, post oak, blackjack oak savanna in northwestern Georgia. But I want to step back to the year 2013, 12 years ago. 2013 was a big year for a couple of reasons. First, it was a year that a couple of the leading conservation organizations in North America published a map of America's grasslands. You'll see that the familiar Great Plains and Midwestern tallgrass prairies were mapped. So were some of the western grasslands. But notice that this giant chunk of the southeast and lower parts of the northeast were essentially left off the map. That green boundary that you see is the SGI focal boundary, which includes parts of 24 states, but only just some of the prairies extending into Texas and Oklahoma and a little bit of Louisiana were covered in this 2013 map. Now that same year, Dr. Reed Noss, who today serves as SGI's chief science advisor, Reed published a book called Forgotten Grasslands of the South, in which case he really challenged this idea that the South and East doesn't have grasslands. He talked about the exceptional diversity of eastern grasslands like prairies and savannas, but also mountaintop grasslands like balds that we get in the Appalachian Mountains, rocky types of small-scale grasslands like glades and barrens, even certain kinds of wetland grasslands like fens and wet meadows, certain kinds of marshes, and in the deepest canyons of southern Appalachia, we have grasslands that are maintained not by fire or buffalo, but by floods, and we call these river scour grasslands. So the South is home to an amazing diversity, and if you haven't read Reed Noss's book, you got to go out and get it. It's an amazing read and a great all-around introduction to natural history of the Eastern United States. Now, one of the things that Reed was not really able to do in his book was to address exactly where these grasslands used to be, in terms of mapping. He showed a few maps, but there was no comprehensive, up-to-date modern map that showed the distribution of these grasslands. So that led to, as we began to create the Southeastern Grasslands Institute, one of our primary goals was to begin to figure out what kinds of grasslands do we have and where were they. So for that, we published a paper in 2021 with Reed Noss as our lead author that recognized 118 types of southeastern grassland ecological systems. Now, importantly, the foreword to Reed Noss's book, it was written by the preeminent naturalist E.O. Wilson, who happens to also be a native of Alabama. In the foreword of that book, Wilson writes that the southern grassland biome, a term which he coined, when it's properly defined to include longleaf pine savanna, is probably the richest terrestrial biome in all of North America. To understand, cherish, and preserve the great natural heritage of the southern grassland biome should be a priority goal in America's environmental movement. And we agree. This was 12 years ago, however. And until about 5 or 6 years ago, very few people were willing to embrace this notion that there were once large and biodiverse grasslands in the Southeast that were important at a continental scale. And to have those words come from E.O. Wilson was truly crossing a threshold. And behind this is a beautiful Alabama grassland from the state where E.O. Wilson is from. This is the beautiful black belt prairie that grades into a savanna in the distance. So let's just talk about some of the reasons why southern grasslands are important. Well, one, they are at the heart of a newly recognized global biodiversity hotspot. Again, when you include these treed savanna grasslands, they're really just grasslands with scattered trees. This is at the epicenter of this hotspot. This was recognized again in a publication by Reed Noss from 2015, where he and colleagues advocated that because of the high amounts of biodiversity in the Southeast, particularly in these grassy ecosystems, that they actually formed the world's newest global biodiversity hotspot, what's called the Southeastern Coastal Plain Hotspot. And so now parts of the lower eastern United States join the ranks of other globally important regions around the world in terms of their critical importance to biodiversity. And if we begin to look deeper at the patterns within that hotspot, you'll see all these kind of areas light up on the map. These are areas where there are outstanding levels of endemic species of plants, such as the Southern Appalachians, parts of central Tennessee, or central and northwestern Florida. And then if you look deeper at those, a major reason for those endemic species is they're endemics to open ecosystems like glades and barrens and prairies and savannas. So those really have a large amount of contribution to this new hotspot. We also been looking deeper at the statistics behind the importance of southeastern grasslands. As I said, there are 118 types, like this coastal dune grassland in northwest Florida, for example. If you look at all of the rare ecosystems of the southeastern United States, there are over 1,200 that are considered to be globally imperiled. Of that, 49% represent types of grassy ecosystems, like dunes and river scour and meadows and fens and bogs and savannas, for example. But if you go ahead and add open, grassy, fire-maintained woodlands to that as well, then combined grasslands plus open woodlands account for 70% of all the endangered ecosystems in the South. Forest and forested wetlands, by comparison, make up the other combined 30%. Southern grasslands are also home to over half of the estimated plants and animals of the southeastern grasslands region. So just think about all the pollinators and the native plant species. And some of these numbers are pretty truly staggering. 1 square meter of savanna can have up to 52 species of plants in it. There are 90 species of bees known from a single prairie remnant in Oktibbeha County, Mississippi. Similar numbers have been found in other kinds of sites. Ultimately, all this plant diversity and insect diversity translates into what we call groceries on the ground for wildlife, food for turkeys and deer and bobwhite quail, and numerous other species of game animals in particular. So they're of wide importance, not only to those who care for biodiversity's sake, but also for outdoorsmen and hunters and nature enthusiasts. If we start to unpack some of the numbers with regard to rare species, take a look at plants. This is an analysis we did for the state of Maryland, just as an example. 63% of over 700 rare plants in Maryland need open ecosystems. That's non-forested, open, grassy ecosystems. And then you can see the division here, like tidal salt marshes and herbaceous open wet meadows, glades and barrens, etc. Again, the smaller percentage occurs in true forested habitats and forested wetlands. And so I'd ask you to think about that if you were to really stack up all of the conservation work that's been done in Eastern North America, most of the funding and support and land acquisition projects, et cetera, have really been toward forested ecosystems, especially east of the Mississippi River. By our estimation, when we begin to dig into the historical record and look for clues to where grasslands were, because that's what we want to do, we want to map them as well. They probably covered somewhere between 40 and 50% of the eastern US landscape. That's a staggering statistic. That is revolutionary. To our knowledge, no one in the history of sort of vegetation ecology or in mapping has proposed such a large amount of the eastern US landscape was this open historically. And so that's something that we obviously have to substantiate with evidence as well. And I'll get back to that in a minute. In the meantime, southern grasslands come in all shapes and sizes, from small, tiny mountainside patches like this Serpentine Barren in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. By the way, there are 3 species of plants here that are only found in this one mountainside grassland and nowhere else on Earth. Some of our grasslands covered hundreds of square miles, like these beautiful shortleaf pine, post oak savannas that once covered the Cumberland Plateau surface, Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, and Kentucky. Small bogs and wet meadows and fens like Bluff Mountain Fen near Boone, North Carolina, an exquisite example of an old growth fen wet meadow complex. But sadly, most of the eastern grasslands, like Midwestern grasslands, have been lost by more than 90% of their original distribution. And some types have been lost by more than 99%. This is a beautiful remnant prairie and meadow in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Some of these are ancient communities. They are undoubtedly thousands of years old. They take a long time to assemble as natural communities. This is called Suther Wet Prairie. It's the last of its kind in central North Carolina. And they are important for carbon sequestration, for combating climate change. These are exceptionally important for their carbon drawdown potential as well. This is the beautiful restored savanna called Catoosa Wildlife Management Area in Tennessee. Many parts are much more open than this. This is a little bit more on the woodland end of the scale. So let's next talk about the story of how eastern and southeastern grasslands have influenced American history, and how this is really a story that remains largely untold. So we're going to go back to the Shenandoah Valley that we talked about earlier. Down in the heart of this valley, there's a beautiful remnant prairie that is a old growth ecosystem home to many rare and conserved species, like the queen of the prairie, for example, Filipendula rubra. This prairie has somehow managed to exist even after 400 years of highly intensive Euro-American settlement. And if we go back and begin to look at the historical record, we can see these grasslands acknowledged on some of the earliest maps of the region. Berry and Sanson's map from 1680, for example, if we were to zoom in over parts of Virginia and North Carolina, shows Savannah to the east of the Blue Ridge Mountains. And we can even look to some of our well-known leaders, like George Washington himself, for example. Excuse me. This is an excerpt from George Washington's journals from when he was a land surveyor at the age of 16. Surveying some lands in northern Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, he talked about the meadowlands that he encountered south of the Potomac River. Later, historians and others tried to make sense of Washington's journal. They went in to add footnotes as part of what's called the Gutenberg Project. In about 1905, one writer said, "There's no satisfactory explanation of the frequently observed condition that Washington has mentioned, which is the presence of these meadows." So even into the 20th century, people simply didn't have a good explanation as to why there should be open grasslands in parts of northern Virginia. Well, we have a good explanation for it, and that's part of the story. So let's continue. If we begin to look at Thomas Jefferson's father, Peter Jefferson, who was a cartographer and made some maps of Virginia in the 1750s, you can see the Great Meadows are mapped, or the fine lands of the Shenandoah Valley, or the Plains, which is the place of a modern-day town, home to the headquarters of the American Bird Conservancy, just an hour west of D.C. These are all place names that mean grasslands. So we've developed what we call, and we're in the process of developing this for publication, what we call our push-pull hypothesis. That basically, as the European populations were increasing on the eastern coast in the 1600s and 1700s, that two factors were at play. Number one, that those European settlers were, because of the density of population, they were being pushed off of the Atlantic seaboard, right? They were getting too crowded. They wanted to go and have their own lands to farm and to hunt. So that push factor was important. But what's equally important, in our opinion, is the pull. They were being attracted to something. And that something was not the prospect of going into an uninhabited wilderness of endless forest, as we've often been told. That would not have been attractive. What was attractive was the fact that there were an abundance of these fine lands or meadowlands in the Appalachian valleys that served to attract those early settlers coming in from Washington and from Williamsburg and Jamestown and those other cities up and down the Atlantic coast. We begin to follow this sort of push-pull factor, and you can actually trace the tide of American settlement down the ridge and valley of Tennessee and Virginia and through the Cumberland Gap. Many people in America have gone, who have ancestors that went through that gap, eventually went on to migrate westward into the Midwest or into California or Oregon. And along the way, they traveled through grasslands. And their contemporaneous stories and accounts of that are well documented in the American annals of American history, though they've largely been sort of forgotten or just overlooked. We can look to the accounts of early hunters and explorers like Daniel Boone, for example. Here in the upper left is a photograph looking west across the bluegrass region of Kentucky in about the 1940s. In the lower right is an artist's sketch that showed what Daniel Boone might have seen looking off of the similar view to herds of bison going out into the plains of the bluegrass, the outer bluegrass. So again, this was a grassland landscape that was juxtaposed against the hills of Appalachia. But as Americans began to migrate west into the interior in states like Tennessee and Kentucky and Ohio and Illinois, again, the lesson is they were attracted not by the prospect of going into heavy forest, but by going into open landscapes. And many of those landscapes have been under indigenous management for thousands of years. Some of those were possibly created by Native Americans, but some of them undoubtedly were also natural grasslands as well. In the decades preceding the Civil War, we really see the importance of these open landscapes really coming to light. It's these open ecosystems, those prairies and those meadowlands, that were sought after for plantation agriculture. And those were the places where, as slavery was increasing in our nation, those were the lands exploited first. So it should be no surprise then, after all this time, that those areas conducive to agriculture is where we lost the greatest amount of our grasslands, sometimes by 99.99%. So this is one reason why today, or in 2013, Reed Noss called them the forgotten grasslands of the South. And it's largely because they were lost so early in American history, that they were lost before the camera was invented. They were lost before they could be painted or sketched. And many regions were poorly explored until the decade or two after the Civil War. They had already changed by 80 to 100 years from their pre-settlement condition. So take this landscape here, for example. This could be the Flint Hills of Kansas, but it's not. This is Montgomery, Alabama, as it appeared in 1775 to the botanist, William Bartram. A friend of mine painted this scene, and he's a landscape architect, and he also uses historical clues to reconstruct what this land would have looked like. But to also get an understanding of how forgotten these grasslands are, and it's understandable that those of us in the 21st and 20th centuries wouldn't know about them because so much time has gone by. But let's look at the words of William Foote from 1846. He says, previous to the year 1750, the solitary cabins were found upon the borders of prairies and in the vicinities of canebrakes. The immense ranges abounding with wild game and affording sustenance the whole year for herds of tame cattle. There were extensive tracts of country between the Yadkin and the Catawba rivers, now waving with thrifty forests, basically now waving with tall, skinny trees that then were covered with tall grass, with scarcely a bush or a shrub, the abundant grass luxuriating in its native wildness and beauty. He was describing extensive, nearly treeless prairies in places like Charlotte, North Carolina, that already by 1750 had been converted to forested landscapes, largely due to fire suppression and the extermination of bison. So by the time I got interested in grasslands, and having been born and raised in Middle Tennessee, I had sort of heard a completely different story. I never was raised hearing about the descriptions of William Bartram or the beautiful grasslands of the Carolina Piedmont. I heard a different story from my history teacher in the 6th grade, who said that at the time the first Europeans got here, that all of eastern United States was so densely forested that a squirrel could travel from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River without ever touching the ground. So we've done a poll, and I'd like to just see how many of you have heard the same myth of the squirrel.
Yeah, let's give it just a couple seconds for anybody who hasn't voted. All right, it looks like primarily no. We have just shy of 60 people who have answered, and 44 of them have said no.
You know, that's not unexpected, because when I go further west, particularly Kansas or Texas, usually the percentage is very low. But anytime I speak to audiences who are primarily centered east of the Mississippi, particularly the Southeast, it seems to be really prevalent in those geographies. So thank you very much. It's always exciting to kind of see the regional trends and knowledge here. So we obviously have this condition of what we call shifting baselines, the erosion of common knowledge. And before I transition in the next part of the talk, I want to talk about shifting baselines. If you were to take the old Great Wagon Road that led from Philadelphia down to Baltimore in, say, 1680, then you would have known that there were grasslands in northeastern Maryland, for example. Or if you were on a train across parts of central Tennessee in 1850, you would have known about the grasslands because you could see them from your train window, or you'd travel through them on the wagon road. And all your friends would know about them and your family members. And you'd say, oh, yeah, my cow got lost in the barrens today. But that common knowledge eroded by just a couple of generations later, such that people somehow lost track of that information. And that younger people then grew up under this perception that it was all forested. Now, how that severance happened of that common knowledge, I'm not exactly sure. And that's going to be the subject of many of my writings that I'll talk about on my Substack account. So again, if you can, be sure to subscribe to my theprairiepreacher.substack. Check me out, where we'll examine that further. To illustrate this point, check out this quote. This is from W.B. Maury, who is a historian. And one of the things that Maury talks about is, he says, many an old farmer born and raised within the area of the Barrens, this is north of Baltimore, Maryland, they would stand you down in the face of irrefutable evidence that his part of the state never was nor could have been a barrens. Basically, they just wouldn't believe you. Modern day farmers in the early 1900s would simply never believe that their land had once been a barrens or a grassland. Now, this erosion of knowledge is tightly correlated with the movement patterns of westward migration. So we see, as I've shown you, that the farther east you are, the earlier those grasslands disappeared. Those grasslands near Philadelphia were gone by 1710 or 1720. Those near Charlotte, gone by 1750. Knoxville, Tennessee, grasslands largely gone by 1800. The Mississippi River by the Civil War, and so forth. As farther west you go, the more intact and the more recent those grasslands are. So the farther east you are, south of the Ohio and east of the Mississippi especially, if you want to see what's left of our grasslands, you got to look at sites that are on the really rocky end of the spectrum, or places that are too wet. Or you go to power line corridors or roadside margins. Many of our friends in the Midwest know about roadside prairies or cemetery prairies. It's kind of the same phenomenon. It's like these are areas that are kind of on the edge along fence rows where you might still see what's left. So sadly, the eastern grasslands have been erased from society's collective memory, but they are still here if you know what to look for. And so one of the things that I kind of do is use my knowledge and experience almost like a forensic scientist to go out and piece these together and find them, these remnants. So our grasslands largely have three fates here in the east. The once open savanna grasslands of scattered trees, well, they succumbed once we stopped fires from burning and we lost eastern populations of bison and elk. They grew up and became closed canopy forests that are dry forests. And then we also had the fertile meadowlands like the Shenandoah Valley, which were overgrazed and then later improved, so to speak, by bringing in non-native Eurasian grasses like tall fescue. They became monocultures of pasture. And then finally, we had open prairies with no trees or very few trees on really arable, rich soils. These were, through slave agriculture, converted in some of the biggest agricultural districts of the South, like the cotton fields of Alabama and the cornfields of Western Kentucky. So our prairies became croplands. These are the greatest percentage of loss, 99.99% in all cases of our former southern prairies have been destroyed. Now we're using various forms of science to kind of understand where these grasslands were and kind of how we can recognize them. One of the new tools that we're developing is sort of based in some form off of what's called the coefficients of conservatism that our friends Swink and Wilhelm developed out of the Chicago area. This grassland fidelity index eventually will be used as a tool for those who study vegetation to be able to identify whether a site should be a grassland or should be more on the open end of the spectrum. So I don't have a lot of time to go into this, but we are working on a publication to offer this new tool to vegetation ecologists called the Grassland Fidelity Index. And it combines two factors, conservatism, how conservative is a plant, with heliophytism, basically how much does it need sunlight. And if you put those two factors together, things that are both highly conservative and need a lot of sun, those are your grassland indicator species. And so you can use this tool in some really cool ways, and stay tuned on that. And here's what we mean by conservative heliophytes. Basically, species that need savannas and woodlands and prairies and glades and barrens, a lot of sunflowers, a lot of aster species and goldenrods and coneflowers, many of our peas and lespedezas and goat's roots and other kinds of species. All of these would be sort of indicators of conservative heliophytic plants. These are the indicators we look for when we try to find prairie and savanna remnants. Lots of milkweeds as well. Certain types of violets and prairie phlox and certain species of larkspur. But we also have shrubs that can tell the story of former grasslands, like hazelnuts and New Jersey tea, crabapples and hawthorns. These are all mostly groups that need open, high sunlight conditions to thrive. Even trees. We often here in the South talk about shortleaf pine and longleaf pine, post oak, blackjack oak, even bur oak, mockernut hickory. These are more grassland and open grassy woodland species than they are forest trees. In fact, most of these cannot even reproduce in forest and woodlands. They can only reproduce from open grassy woodlands or savannas or prairies. So you can go into sites like this and sort of ask the question, is this a real forest or is it an artificial forest that actually, under a different fire regime and under a point in time when it had Native American management or it had bison, would it have instead been a savanna or an open woodland or even a prairie? The Grassland Fidelity Index will help determine these and sort of elucidate these past histories. One of the things that we're seeing is that it isn't just the transformation of the landscape, but it's also edge habitats. So for example, our bogs and our natural depression pond marshes, many of them historically were surrounded by prairie and savanna. When you take fire away, they get closed in. So the whole edge of the pond ecosystem has been highly altered. The edges of our bogs and fens, the edges of our glades and barrens, likewise. Instead of being open, an open ecotone that used to go into adjacent upland grassland ecosystems, there's now a wall of vegetation there where they go right into a wall of overly dense trees and shrubs that's highly unnatural. Therefore, we're losing a lot of the species that depend on those edge ecotone habitats as well. Next, let's transition into sort of what is the current state of conservation of many of our different types of grasslands. Well, first of all, most of them are highly threatened or endangered. That's just clear right off the bat. Even this type of mountaintop grassland in North Carolina's Blue Ridge Mountains, while it's publicly owned and managed, we've already lost about 50% of this ecosystem due to displacement by forests at the lower elevations down there. So some of those adjacent mountainsides in the 1880s were open grassland. With continued climate change, we are projected to lose these grasslands entirely. We don't know exactly when, but over the next centuries, it's likely that they will be displaced by forests. Certain types of our grasslands in the east fall into this category, and like some of the eastern serpentine barrens. These are also highly threatened types of grasslands with trees. The second major category are those that are functionally extinct, basically have been completely eradicated from the landscape. We have a painting on the far left, for example, because we don't actually have patches anymore left to show you in real world view. So we have to use paintings to depict what they might have looked like. Or we have to go to these power line corridors to see the remnants and the evidence of their former presence. Places like the Grand Prairie of the Shenandoah Valley is one of those examples of essentially a functionally extinct grassland, because this is the last example left that we have that is somewhat intact. And this is only about 10 acres in size. And we even have indicator species like the prairie fringed orchid that occurs in those Shenandoah Valley grasslands, although it's now been completely eliminated from Northern Virginia. The third category are extinct grasslands. This is probably a great example. These are the Long Island, New York, what they call the Hempstead Plains. These are photographs in the University of Alabama archives taken by ecologist Dr. Roland Harper from around 1904. It showed beautiful, open, vast prairies and savannas. They were home to the heath hen, the cousin to the greater prairie chicken. Sadly, that species was driven to extinction. Today, these grasslands are completely gone, with the exception of one 24-acre patch adjacent to Nassau Community College on Long Island. So other kinds of grasslands clearly fall into this category across the region as well. We don't have time to go into a lot of these quotes, so I'll pass by, but we do see the remnants and evidence of these in herbarium specimen records, and occasionally people will find a patch of prairie willow on the side of a road that is a holdover from one of those former grassland regions that's now essentially extinct. You can see the collapse of species like the American blue hearts, Buchnera americana, which is a great grassland obligate species, or Desmodium sessilifolium. Look at the collapse of that species in the east, shown by the orange and yellow highlighted counties. Orange means they're historical. Yellow means it's threatened or endangered. The fourth category of our grasslands of the South are those that are highly restorable. These would be the grasslands where there's still good chance to bring back a lot of acreage. But notice the photo behind this is a picture of a forest ecosystem. Well, some recent research by the University of Tennessee, Dr. Andy Vanderyacht, in a paper published titled Litter to Glitter, really shows what happens. When you take an artificial forest that used to be a savanna in the 1880s and before, what happens when you do one selective cut of the trees and you bring in 3 prescribed fires over about a 10-year period? This is what happens. In this particular case, and this is not suitable for everywhere, but here where we had pretty good evidence to suggest that the grasslands were recoverable, the seed bank and the bud bank responded in, again, one timber cut, leaving trees like shortleaf pines and post oaks and blackjack oaks and white oaks, and then really significantly reducing the tree cover and the mid canopy cover. The ground responded, especially after we burnt off that leaf litter. All this came back from underground. It was literally hiding underneath the leaf litter and suppressed by shade for almost 100+ years. So this has a great lesson where rattlesnake master and blazing star and so many other species and 6 or 7 rare species have also come back at this site. So this has great lessons for many different areas across the East with similar histories where the grasslands became closed canopy forests due to things like fire suppression. We're seeing conservative species rebounding here. These are not weedy sites. And in places like Tennessee's Appalachians, where in the forested coves we might have 20 rare plant species in those, what really should be forest and should not be logged, we may have 20 rare plant species. But if you get up on top of those tableland plateaus there, those are the areas where the savannas used to be. And that's where we have more than 120 species that are desperately clinging to power line corridors and roadsides, and they need their savannas restored to those open lands. If only we had known sooner in these regions, we could have saved Clark Range, the home of the buffaloes in Fentress County, Tennessee. Also, it's where Mark Twain was conceived in this town, by the way, nearby Jamestown. But we could have saved the buffaloes. We could have saved the American chaff seed and the green pitcher plant. and the red-cockaded woodpecker, which is a savanna obligate species. Northern pine snakes wouldn't have disappeared. Northern bobwhite quail wouldn't be slipping away. Yellow-fringed orchids wouldn't be slipping away. And the frosted elfin butterfly, which needs Baptisia plants, wouldn't be disappearing and facing the prospect of being added to the endangered species list. But we didn't know sooner. And unfortunately, our wildlife and our species have been disappearing. I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit and say that it's well past time for our grasslands and open grassy woodlands to have an equal seat at the conservation table. And those of you in the Midwest, y'all get it. Y'all know this story. You have a long history of leadership for the rest of us in America about why prairies and savannas and meadows are important. But, to my friends farther west in the Pacific Northwest, who also have grasslands that are suffering like those in the Southeast and the Northeast, we need to do better in our regions to make sure that grasslands are given the same level of priority and emphasis as forests, as streams, and wetlands. And there's no greater time because the imperilment of our biodiversity, like the loss of grassland birds, is the greatest group of birds in decline. And of course, the need to combat climate change is never greater. But unfortunately, the South is a rapidly changing place. This is what the projections look like for urban sprawl in the next 25 years. Literally, if we wait another second to get started, 25 years will come so soon we won't even know what hit us. And our savannas and prairies that we have now, which are the last 1/100%, will simply be no possibility for recovery. So let me switch as I get ready to conclude in the final set of slides about what is the Southeastern Grasslands Institute doing to try to tackle this monumental problem. First, we were founded in 2018. We now have built up to a team of 50 employees, and we're guided by science and history. And we thanks to our founding partners at the Band Foundation for believing in us and helping us to get to this point. We have a 24-state geography, which covers parts of the lower Midwest and the lower Northeast. And the green that you see there is our latest attempt to map the grassy ecosystems of the southeastern U.S., again, including grassy woodlands. We're definitely not saying that all of southern half of Georgia was an open treeless prairie. So definitely don't mistake that point. But what we are saying is that it was a much grassier landscape historically. Now, I do want to go ahead and quickly drop this nugget of good news on you, and that is that SGI in 2026, September 2026, we're going to be hosting the Eastern Native Grassland Symposium. We would love to have some of our friends from the Midwest come down and join us for that. That's going to be in a joint conference between Tennessee and Kentucky. So just a little bit to conclude about what SGI is doing in terms of visually. We do a lot of work with grassland inventory and monitoring, with mammals, with grassland birds, with plants. We do a lot of outreach, talking about it in seminars and field trips. We are trying to up our publication game with both popular guides and scientific white papers and in-depth publications and peer-reviewed materials. We're trying to cover all the bases. We do have an upcoming publication with National Geographic where we're working on mapping a new map of Eastern United States to show where grasslands would have been. So stay tuned for that in the next year or so as we try to get that work wrapped up. We've got an exciting new decision support tool that we call Grasslandia. Can't tell you a lot about it now, but basically it's going to be an online portal for all things grasslands, grassland biodiversity, story maps, maps of grasslands, information for practitioners, you name it. And I realize I'm getting a little short on time here. So Sarah, let me just ask you just a minute here. I needed to wrap up by 2:45. Can I get another 5 minutes perhaps?
Absolutely. Yep, no problem.
Perfect. I don't want to rush on these last few slides because they are really important. We're doing a lot now with regional planning and with on-the-ground conservation. That's one of the areas of growth I'm most excited about SGI and where we're heading. I will say that it's the most difficult and trying time right now we've ever experienced. And I do want to acknowledge the federal funding freeze is causing massive ramifications for both ourselves and our partners around the country. Farmers that we work with, seed producers, no one is immune to this public federal funding freeze that's happening right now, and it's making our work very, very challenging. But until the freeze, I'm gonna tell you some of the good things that we're still doing. We are working on sort of large scale regional planning. So we've got a upcoming plan that covers parts of 4 states, where we're looking at doing a grassland status assessment and long range plan across the Cumberland Plateau. This will help us understand where grasslands used to be within this region and where they can be again. So we can create large scale and small scale grassland preserves and a plan to make sure that our grasslands in this region stay intact. We also will this year be forming the SGI Foundation and Land Trust. As a nonprofit and having land trust capabilities, we're going to be really targeting those smaller acreages that, frankly, many conservation organizations have given up on, like this 7-acre prairie here along the Tennessee-Kentucky line. A lot of organizations might not be willing to buy and try to manage 7 acres or 3 acres or 1 acre of remnant prairie. We think that these are critical. These are irreplaceable, and we want to do everything within our power to make sure that we provide a safety net for sites like these. This one has 5,000 plants of the tall green milkweed, Asclepias hirtella, on it. It's too important to lose. At the same time, we're collecting seed off of these plants, and we have a seed bank with our partners at the Bureau of Land Management and Fish and Wildlife Service. We work with native seed producers like Roundstone Native Seed to make sure not only that the genetics of these plants are harvested and cared for and curated, but that we have the species seed mixes needed to restore our lands. Here's a 77 species seed mix that we have planted in partnership with Roundstone and Google on about a 110-acre restoration in central Tennessee. And having the access to these diverse seed mixes is critically important. We're now working with Google to consider expanding that from 110 acres to 550 acres, making it the largest prairie restoration in the South. But restoring prairie takes people. We are grateful to the funding that we've received because it puts people to work. Helping with prescribed fire and invasive species removal. These all take time and dedication. So we've been staffing up to try to meet the demands of that effort. We're also excited to be working with indigenous tribes across the South. And thanks to funding from the USDA, we have a team of 3 tribal liaisons. In fact, just last night, I got back from an exciting trip to Alabama where we met with the Muskogee Nation. And they graciously invited us to join them for 3 hours of performing a sacred dance last night called the Stomp Dance under the moon of a late night sky in Alabama. It was incredible. And finally, we are creating destinations and empowering volunteers to play a role. This is inspired by the great work done by the Citizens for Conservation out of Chicago, a model which we would like to emulate for years and years to come. So I thank you for your time. We have a big aspirations and dreams of continuing to rebuild prairies across the Southeast, and the great work and leadership that our Midwestern colleagues has provided is really what helped us to form this vision and to keep going. And thank you all for your time and your interest. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dwayne. It is such a joy and inspiring to hear what you all are doing down there. So thank you. We do have some questions that I would love to relay over to you. So Gabriel Bertelson noticed that one of your slides had a drawing that suggested a correlation between what he called bumpiness of the terrain and position on the continuum from grassland to savanna, woodland, and forest. Can you clarify whether that is what the drawing meant, and how much this continuum on the terrain holds true in the Southeast?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that is that's a great question. Let me get back to that slide. Here it is. Yeah, so this is that I should have the acknowledgement down from where this comes. This is from Paul Nelson, who wrote The Terrestrial Natural Communities of Missouri, one of my favorite books. And what Paul Nelson, I think it's in chapter 3 of that book, shows this correlation between the landscape, where the flatter the landscape is, typically you would associate with the ability of fire to move across that landscape, larger fire compartment sizes. And in most of the eastern United States and central United States, the big flat rolling landscapes are the places where the historical record shows were also prairies. Then when you get into those more rolling landscapes, particularly those with sandy or even rocky soils, we tend to see those favoring more savanna. And again, the land survey records are really important to sort of clarifying that. And then as you get into really broken landscapes where it gets very hilly and dissected, that's where you would tend to associate with more natural woodland or true natural closed canopy forest. One important thing that's not shown here, though, is that in the east, one of the things we often see are grasslands and valleys. And those are meadows where, it's really not captured by this. Sarah, was there another component to that question?
How much of this continuum on the terrain holds true in the southeast?
Yeah, I think it holds. I think it absolutely is very applicable to the southeast, with the exception of the meadows. So, if I were going to amend this, and we've actually talked about sort of doing our own version, we would probably amend this to show some wide valleys in that lower portion on forest there. That actually we do have valley bottom grasslands. So, just because it's a stream valley, that it's not necessarily makes, and it's in a mesophytic area with plenty of rainfall, does not mean forest was necessarily the natural vegetation there.
Very helpful, thank you. Kathleen Carlisle asks how SGI ensures the long-term management of their restorations.
It's a good question. When we formed the land trust this year, one of the things we'll obviously be doing is trying to work on endowments for the properties that we manage, putting lands under conservation easement. So far, we operate as part of a university here in Tennessee. And so while we have purchased some lands with the university, they're close to our university, and we use them for research and teaching sites. And so they are actually owned by the university in this case, and serve as outdoor classrooms. That helps to protect them, and we've got some clauses in that they can't be sold and those kind of things. But I do think once we form the land trust, it'll be incumbent upon us to put easements on those and to have the proper stewardship endowments to support those. And that's a big focus of ours this year.
All right. Megan McCrum would like to know whether you harvest the trees that you remove for timber or other uses, and can harvests like these support your restoration efforts?
Yeah, we as an organization have not yet gotten into the timber harvest arena. That's an example that one of our state agencies here in Tennessee did, and that actual case was connected to what I would call sort of an accident. There was a salvage timber operation in that particular case. There was a pine beetle outbreak that was going to damage a bunch of trees, so they made the decision to go in and remove the timber. And then they didn't really do it with the plan of restoring grasslands. What they did was they removed the timber and sold the timber, and then sort of were surprised that these grasslands just came out of nowhere. That really was one of the game changers and the conversation starters that really began to clue us into Tennessee that, oh my gosh, where did all these grasslands come from? They literally just came out of the ground. But today, other similar efforts have been undertaken. Sure, you can cut the trees. In some cases, they can be marketable. You can absolutely pay for the conservation in some efforts by harvesting the timber responsibly and selling it to pay for the efforts. You need to be very careful that you don't disturb the soil unnecessarily, and that you leave the appropriate right trees remaining. And then there are other cases to where, maybe it's not as easy as that. And sometimes the timber market, for example, is not good for cedar trees, for example, that fluctuates. And admittedly, this is a very controversial topic. There are lots of conservation friends and organizations who would readily go to battle over this issue. But I'm here to tell you, having seen multiple great examples where this is proven to be not only effective, but vital to recovering lost grasslands, we absolutely need to entertain this in a big scale. And I would say this, don't knock it until you've come to Tennessee and seen these examples. I think the proof is walking into these with a knowledgeable person who knows about their natural history.
Very interesting. Preston Drum asks whether you have plans to work with municipalities and local governments to lobby for restoring grasslands in combination with development that you spoke of. He's actually from Charlotte, North Carolina, and has observed how nature is being overtaken by housing and commercial development, and wondering, can grasslands somehow exist with these kinds of development projects?
That's a great question. It's hard. Right now, we don't have much of an apparatus for staying ahead of the urban sprawl and all the land that's consuming. That's a plight that is just sad, and it's very difficult to wrap our arms around. What we are trying to do is identify the remnants that is near or within those urban areas and ensure that we're doing all we can to knock on doors and say, hey, do you know you got a prairie remnant in your front yard? Let us at least try to keep that site stable and secure for the next few years. We call that stabilization. Let's keep it alive this year and next year. That's a big focus of ours now. And then we are working very effectively with cities like the city of Nashville, the city of Chattanooga, Tennessee. We've got large scale grassland projects across multiple sites, mostly in those cases, rebuilding grasslands with those cities on city parks. So definitely the conversation is improving. We're getting a lot of interest, but the urban sprawl eating up grasslands is still a massive risk, unfortunately.
All right. I think we'll take maybe two more questions. So Heather Holm commented that the term forest is applied to any treed place. How do you communicate the continuum and fire dependence?
Yeah, it's a great question. I often say I don't really care if you call it a forest or a woodland or a savanna or a grassland with trees. The important part is, and I mean to say an open forest, the important part is that we all sort of understand what it needs. I really try not to get hung up on the nomenclature. I like to call them savannas when they have a certain structure, but a friend of mine who works for the Forest Service would be like, well, I call it a forest, open forest. I was like, that's cool. We just need to agree on what it needs. It needs a certain amount of management and fire. And what this Grassland Fidelity Index tool will help us to be able to do is be able to actually monitor that with data. And I wish it was not so premature to be able to give you more details. So yeah, I think that's a big deal, is just not to get hung up on the nomenclatural complexities too much.
All right. Let's end with this question. This is kind of a fun one from Kelly Kearns, who's wondering, for those who would like to visit some of your higher quality remnants or restorations, where would we find information about them?
It's a great question. So our materials on our website on where to visit a grassland is highly outdated. We are overhauling that currently. So I would say stay tuned. I think in the next few months, we'll be having some good materials on like where to visit a grassland near you, and you'll be able to access that. The Grasslandia portal that I spoke of, which is we're super excited to unveil in about a year from now, that's going to have all that content as well. So once Grasslandia hits the airwaves or the internet waves, you'll be able to dig in and use Grasslandia as an exploratory tool for the southeastern United States.
Sounds exciting. Well, we'll look forward to it.
Thank you
Dwayne,
so much.
thank you so much for such an engaging conversation. It's been a pleasure. For the rest of our attendees, we have our last beverage coffee, I guess not coffee, but beverage chat this afternoon. There are 6 left from 5 to 6 p.m. And then we will wrap up the day with our final feature presentation at 6:30. So thank you all for joining for this presentation, and we'll see you soon. Thanks, Dwayne.
That's